Over the millennia, we have only known one side of cosmic history, that written and propagated by the victors. The great institutional religions have shaped our perception of the forces that govern the universe, categorizing beings and events into simplistic boxes of good and evil. Lucifer, the once resplendent angel, has been reduced to a one-dimensional symbol of darkness, sin, and rebellion, an inverted mirror of everything we should avoid. But what would happen if we gave voice to the silenced? If the parchments kept in the shadows, the forbidden texts and the hidden manuscripts could finally tell their side of the story? Gnostic manuscripts, apocryphal texts, and ancient esoteric knowledge suggest a radically different narrative about the one who was called the bringer of light. What if, instead of a simple villain, Lucifer represented an act of cosmic courage that challenged a divine tyranny? What if everything you believe about the greatest fall in spiritual history was only half the truth? Stop for a moment and think. How many times in your life have you accepted a truth without questioning its origin? What if everything you've been told about Lucifer is incomplete, or worse, deliberately distorted? The well-known story is clear and simple. An arrogant angel defied his creator out of pride and envy, and was then banished from paradise, becoming the architect of evil. This narrative, repeated for 2,000 years, has taken deep root in our collective psyche. However, as any serious historical analysis teaches us, the truth is rarely one-sided. The great empires have always rewritten the history of the conquered. The dominant religions have always demonized the gods of the vanquished. Rome turned pagan deities into demons, and early Christianity absorbed and reformulated earlier traditions to establish its theological supremacy. This pattern is repeated at every turn in human history. Whoever holds the power controls the narrative. Manuscripts discovered in recent decades reveal alternative versions of cosmic origins that diverge dramatically from the canonical texts. What we find in these ancient documents is not a simple villain, but a complex figure who challenged an authority he considered tyrannical. An entity who questioned not the existence of the divine, but its interpretation and application in the cosmos. Among the Gnostic texts, Lucifer appears not as the adversary of humanity, but as its potential liberator. A being who saw something fundamentally problematic in creation and in the relationship between the Creator and his creatures. Have you ever wondered why an omniscient God would eternally punish a creature that he himself created imperfect? This contradiction did not escape the Gnostic thinkers. The apocryphal texts, those documents excluded from the canon during the Great Christian Councils, often paint a much more nuanced picture of the heavenly conflict. In these manuscripts, the fall is not simply an act of betrayal, but a fundamental philosophical schism about the nature of reality and free will. While religious orthodoxy has simplified this story in terms of obedience versus rebellion, the marginalized texts speak of knowledge versus forced ignorance. In the Nag Hammadi library, discovered in Egypt in 1500, texts such as the hypostasis of the Archons describe the Creator God as an imperfect entity and even ignorant of higher powers. This demiurge, as it is called, would not be the true Creator, but an intermediary being who falsely proclaimed himself to be the supreme God. In this cosmology, the bearer of the light would be the one who tried to reveal this truth to creatures trapped in illusion. Esoteric traditions, from medieval alchemy to the initiatic orders of the 19th century, preserved in codes and symbols a vision of Lucifer as the representative of human intellect, enlightenment, and the search for independent knowledge. The very name Lucifer, which literally means light bearer in Latin, suggests a cosmic function related to enlightenment, not darkness. Freemasons of the higher degrees, Martinists, and other esoteric orders studied texts that portrayed the celestial rebel not as a source of evil, but as a catalyst for human spiritual autonomy. For these scholars, the real sin was not in disobedience, but in the blind submission that prevents the soul from growing. Isn't this a profoundly different perspective from the one we've been taught? When we examine the earliest Judeo-Christian writings, we notice that the figure of Satan as we understand him today barely existed. In the book of Job, for example, the adversary, Ha-Satan in Hebrew, was more of a heavenly promoter than an enemy of God. The transformation of this figure into an absolute evil being took place gradually, often for specific political and doctrinal reasons, not by direct revelation. Which brings us to a crucial question. If history has always been written by the victors, who really won this cosmic battle, and what could they be hiding by completely demonizing their adversary? Perhaps the truth is much more complex and disturbing than any religious doctrine has dared to admit. In the scorching sands of Egypt, in December of 1945, a peasant named Muhammad Ali al-Salman made a discovery that would shake the foundations of religious history. While digging for natural fertilizer near the cliffs of Jabal al-Tarif, he found a sealed urn containing 13 leather-bound papyrus codices, the Nag Hammadi library. What Muhammad couldn't have imagined was that he had just unearthed one of the most important treasures of Gnostic texts ever found, documents that had been deliberately hidden for over 1,600 years. The Book of Enoch, excluded from the biblical canon but preserved in Ethiopian tradition, offers a surprising insight into the Watchers, angels who descended to earth and shared forbidden knowledge with humanity. This text, quoted even in the Epistle of Jude in the New Testament, describes an angelic rebellion motivated not by simple evil, but by a fascination with human potential and a desire to transcend the limitations imposed by divine order. Could this be a metaphor for Lucifer's desire to free humanity from the restrictions of knowledge? The Gospel of Judas, recovered in the 1970s after centuries of being lost, presents a shocking narrative. Judas didn't betray Jesus out of greed, but acted on direct instructions from Christ himself as part of a greater cosmic plan. Similarly, Gnostic texts suggest that the Luciferian fall could have been a conscious sacrifice, a necessary maneuver in a cosmic game more complex than the simple dualities of good and evil. In the texts of the Apocrypha of John, we find a radically different cosmogony from the Genesis version. Here, the material world is created not by the supreme God, but by an inferior and imperfect entity called Yaldabaoth, the blind demiurge who falsely proclaims himself the only God. In this vision, the Serpent of Eden, often associated with Lucifer in later interpretations, is not tempting, but liberating, offering knowledge that exposes the fundamental lie about creation. The Nag Hammadi collection includes On the Origin of the World, a text that describes how the Archon Sabaoth, son of the demiurge, rebels against his own father when he realizes the existence of higher powers. This text suggests that rebellion against an illegitimate authority can be not only justified, but divinely inspired, a concept that completely challenges the traditional narrative of Luciferian rebellion as absolute evil. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered between 947 and 956, reveal the theology of the Essene community, which believed in a cosmic war between the Prince of Light and the Angel of Darkness. Interestingly, in these texts, light is associated with truth and knowledge, while darkness represents ignorance and lies, completely reversing Lucifer's traditional association with darkness. Have you ever wondered why the so-called light-bearer would be a representative of darkness? The Emerald Tablets, Hermetic texts attributed to the mythical Hermes Trismegistus, contain the famous axiom, "What is above is like what is below." This philosophy suggests that heaven and hell, God and devil, are polarities of the same reality, not absolutely separate entities. Medieval alchemists, studying these texts, saw Lucifer not as a demon, but as the transforming fire necessary for spiritual transmutation, the very principle of enlightenment necessary for the evolution of the soul. The Book of the Law by Aleister Crowley, a controversial 20th century occultist, proposes a radical interpretation: every man and woman is a star, a direct reference to Lucifer's original identity as the morning star. For Crowley and other modern mystics, the Luciferian myth represents the inevitable journey of human consciousness towards spiritual self-determination, away from the infantilization promoted by authoritarian religions. In the rare surviving fragments of the Gospel of the Egyptians, we find references to a divine antagonist who is not intrinsically evil, but functions as a necessary catalyst for cosmic evolution. This concept echoes deeply in later esoteric traditions, where Lucifer is seen as the necessary thorn that drives the rose of human consciousness to blossom. These texts were not simply forgotten, they were actively suppressed. The Edict of Thessalonica in 380 after Christ, followed by the Council of Nicaea and then the Council of Carthage in 397 after Christ, rigidly defined what was considered inspired scripture and what would be labeled heresy. The consequences for those who preserved or studied these forbidden texts were severe: excommunication, persecution, and often death. Why such fear of alternative texts? What did these narratives contain that posed such a threat to institutionalized religious power? Lucifer, a name derived from the Latin lucem ferae, literally, he who brings light, was originally associated with the planet Venus, the morning star that precedes the dawn. In Isaiah chapter 14 verse 12, the only direct mention of Lucifer in the Latin Vulgate Bible, the term refers metaphorically to the king of Babylon, not to a fallen angel. How, then, did this astronomical symbol and political reference become the archenemy of creation? The answer reveals more about religious politics than genuine theology. In the recovered Gnostic texts, particularly the reality of the Archons, we find a revolutionary cosmogony. The supreme divinity is described as a being of pure light, while the creator of the material world is represented as an inferior and ignorant entity. When this demiurge arrogantly proclaims, "I am God and there is no other besides me," a voice from the higher realm corrects him, "You are mistaken, Samel, the blind god." Doesn't this correcting voice, this light of truth penetrating the darkness of ignorance, embody precisely the role attributed to Lucifer? The Codex Brucianus, a Coptic manuscript dating from the 4th century, describes an entity called Phosphoros, another name for the bearer of light, who voluntarily descends into the lower regions to bring enlightenment to souls trapped in matter. This being is not portrayed as malevolent, but as a compassionate emissary who sacrifices his lofty position to help those trapped in ignorance. How different is this image of the demon thirsting for souls that we have been presented with? In esoteric traditions such as Helena Blavatsky's Theosophy, Lucifer represents the principle of the analytical mind and intellect, precisely the faculties that allow us to question dogma and seek independent understanding. Lucifer is the light-bearer, wrote Blavatsky, the bright and radiant one who opens the eyes of the blind. For her and many other mystics, the fall was not a cosmic tragedy, but the necessary birth of individual consciousness within the undifferentiated mass of creation. The Greek Promethean myth shows remarkable parallels with the Luciferian narrative. Prometheus, whose name means the one who thinks ahead, steals fire from the gods to give it to humanity, suffering eternal punishment for this act of compassion. This archetype of the benefactor punished for defying divine authorities to uplift humanity resonates across multiple cultures. Could it be a coincidence that so many independent traditions contain figures who suffer for bringing forbidden knowledge to humans? The Jewish Kabbalistic tradition offers another intriguing perspective through the concept of Samel, often identified as the angel of death or the serpent of Eden. In the deeper Kabbalistic texts, Samel is described as having a dual nature, simultaneously the greatest prince of heaven and the accuser of humanity. This duality suggests a complex cosmic role, not an absolute evil, but a necessary force that challenges, tests, and, ultimately, strengthens through adversity. Have you ever considered that without resistance, there is no growth? Without questioning, there is no discernment? In the Valentinian manuscripts, an important Gnostic school of the 2nd century, the material world is seen as fundamentally flawed because it was created in ignorance. Rebellion against this imperfect creator would therefore not be an act of evil, but of spiritual clarity, a recognition of the true nature of reality. When we examine the accusations against Lucifer, pride, desire for knowledge, refusal to serve, aren't we seeing precisely the qualities needed to transcend an imperfect creation? The Gospel of Philip, another Nag Hammadi text, contains the enigmatic passage, "Light and darkness, life and death, right and left, are brothers to each other. They are inseparable." This non-dualistic view fundamentally challenges the absolute separation between God and Lucifer that forms the basis of Orthodox theology. What if, instead of irreconcilable opposites, these forces represented complementary principles necessary for cosmic evolution? In certain Mandine texts, a Gnostic religion still practiced in Iraq and Iran, the creator god is called the King of Darkness, despite claiming to be the God of Light. The true messenger of light comes from a higher realm to expose this falsehood. This complete inversion of the traditional narrative raises a provocative question. What if the real darkness was not rebellion, but blind obedience to a deity who demands absolute submission? Medieval alchemical traditions made extensive use of Luciferian symbolism in their work, representing the morning star as the catalytic agent necessary for spiritual transformation. In the true great alchemical work, primitive matter must go through the process of nigredo, darkening, before reaching rubedo, redness, and finally albedo, whitening, symbolizing that the path to enlightenment necessarily involves confronting the darkness within, not denying it. What if Lucifer fell for trying to liberate? This question resonates through the forbidden texts as a reminder that humanity's spiritual history may be much more complex than we have been allowed to know. Rather than a simple adversary, these texts point to a tragic and possibly heroic figure, a being who saw beyond illusions and paid the ultimate price for trying to share this vision with others. What other knowledge remains hidden in the shadows of religious history, waiting for us to have the courage to look beyond the limits of dogma? At the heart of the Gnostic texts lies a revolutionary concept that completely inverts our traditional understanding of creation: the demiurge. This entity is not the true and transcendent God, but a secondary, imperfect, and often ignorant creator. Let's imagine for a moment the implications of this cosmology. The material world, with all its imperfections, sufferings, and contradictions, would not be the work of a supreme and benevolent intelligence, but of a limited being who mistakenly believes he is supreme. The Apocrypha of John, perhaps the most important Gnostic cosmogonic text, describes how this entity, called Yaldabaoth, Samel, or Saklas, arose as a result of a cosmic error when Sophia, wisdom, tried to create without her divine partner. The result was an arrogant being who, unaware of his true origins, proclaimed, "I am God, and there is no God but me." This statement, echoing Isaiah chapter 45 verse 5, is seen in Gnostic texts not as a divine truth, but as the first and most fundamental cosmic lie. What makes this view particularly disturbing for religious orthodoxy is that many Gnostic texts explicitly identify this demiurge with the God of the Old Testament. The God who demands sacrifices, who rages, who destroys entire peoples and demands absolute submission is portrayed not as the true divinity, but as a cosmic usurper. From this perspective, Lucifer's rebellion can be reinterpreted not as a revolt against the supreme good, but as resistance against a cosmic tyranny based on ignorance. In the tripartite treatise, another Nag Hammadi text, material creation is described as fundamentally flawed, a shadow or image of the true spiritual reality. Human beings, containing sparks of true divinity trapped in material bodies, are kept in ignorance by the demiurge, who fears that when they awaken to their true nature, they will escape his control. How can we not see parallels with the Edenic myth, where the knowledge of good and evil is precisely what the Creator forbids his creatures? The Valentinian school of Gnosticism, influential in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, elaborated a complex cosmological system where the true divinity, the pleroma, is absolutely transcendent, while the material world is a distant and corrupt creation. Valentinus taught that Christ and the Holy Spirit were sent not to redeem creation from the demiurge, but to help the divine sparks, pneuma, trapped in it escape back to their spiritual origin. Wouldn't this be the same function attributed to Lucifer in esoteric texts, a liberator of souls trapped in matter? The Gnostic accounts of the fall are particularly revealing. Instead of the traditional narrative of sin and punishment, texts such as On the Origin of the World describe a cosmological process where sparks of true divine light fall, or are sent, into the material realm for one purpose: to illuminate the darkness. These sparks, often identified with higher angels, including the one who would later be called Lucifer, do not fall through transgression, but descend voluntarily on a cosmic mission of rescue and enlightenment. The moral implications of this cosmology are profound. If the material world is not a perfect creation corrupted by sin, but an inherently flawed construction created by a limited being, then salvation would not come from obedience to the laws of this Creator, but from awakening to a higher reality beyond him. The original sin, in this view, would not be disobedience to the Creator, but ignorance of our true nature, an ignorance actively maintained by a demiurge fearful of losing its control over souls. The figure of Sabaoth in the Gnostic texts offers a fascinating counterpoint. Described as the son of the demiurge, Sabaoth witnesses his mother Sophia revealing the existence of higher realities. Unlike his father, he recognizes the truth, repents of his ignorance, and is elevated above the demiurge. This narrative suggests a surprising possibility. Even beings associated with the imperfect Creator can evolve spiritually by recognizing a higher truth. Wouldn't this be a more inspiring model of spiritual growth than simple submission? The concept of Archons, cosmic rulers or guardians who keep souls imprisoned in the material world, appears repeatedly in Gnostic texts. These beings, created by the demiurge, have partially animal forms and are described as blind and ignorant. They represent forces of limitation, dogma, control, everything that prevents the divine spark within the human being from recognizing its true nature. Fighting these forces, as Lucifer would have done, would therefore be an act of spiritual liberation, not evil rebellion. For the Marcionites, an influential current of early Christianity considered heretical, the contrast between the Creator God of the Old Testament and the loving God revealed by Christ was so great that they concluded that they were completely different entities. The former, vengeful, tribal, and violent, was an inferior God, while the true God remained unknown until the revelation of Christ. This view was so threatening to the emerging church that all Marcionite writings were systematically destroyed, surviving only in quotations from their opponents. This radically different understanding of creation and the Creator invites us to a profound reflection. If Lucifer's rebellion was against an ignorant demiurge and not against the true God, this completely redefines the spiritual meaning of this cosmic event. The light brought by Lucifer would not be the false enlightenment of pride, but the genuine awakening to a transcendent truth that the creator of the material world was trying to hide. Isn't this why religious institutions based on the unquestionable authority of this creator have worked so hard to suppress this version of history? The systematic suppression of alternative texts was not a historical accident, but a deliberate campaign that lasted for centuries. The Council of Nicaea in 325 after Christ, convened by Emperor Constantine, marks a turning point in this process. Although it is often remembered for establishing the Nicene Creed and settling disputes about the nature of Christ, this council also began the consolidation of ecclesiastical power that would define which texts would be considered inspired and which would be labeled heretical. Have you ever wondered what criteria were used for these decisions, apart from conformity to the views of the politically dominant bishops? The Edict of Thessalonica, promulgated 380 years after Christ by Emperor Theodosius I, transformed Nicene Christianity into the official religion of the Roman Empire, declaring all other Christian interpretations to be demented and insane. The consequences were immediate and severe: loss of civil rights for heretics, confiscation of property, and, in many cases, exile or execution. This was not simply a theological debate, but a brutal political imposition that effectively silenced all dissenting voices, including those that preserved alternative narratives about Lucifer and the nature of creation. The destruction of the Library of Alexandria, one of the greatest repositories of knowledge in the ancient world, symbolically represents the erasure of alternative thought. Although the exact date and circumstances remain disputed by historians, it is known that thousands of texts considered pagan, Gnostic, or in some way contrary to emerging Christian orthodoxy were lost forever. Among these, how many contained alternative versions of the founding myths of our civilization? How many offered insights into Lucifer, the demiurge, and the true nature of the spiritual reality we will never know? The Council of Carthage in 397 after Christ finalized the biblical canon, officially declaring which books would be included in the Bible and which would be excluded. This decision, often presented as divinely inspired, was actually the result of intense political and theological negotiations. Texts such as the Book of Enoch, previously considered scripture by many early Christian communities, were deliberately excluded, particularly those that presented complex cosmologies or narratives that contradicted the simplicity of the God versus Satan duality that became official doctrine. During the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church consolidated its control over knowledge through various institutional mechanisms. The Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the official list of books forbidden to the Catholic faithful, included not only ancient Gnostic texts, but also philosophical and scientific works that questioned, even indirectly, the official cosmology. The Inquisition, meanwhile, actively persecuted those suspected of preserving or studying forbidden texts. Think about it. Entire institutions dedicated to ensuring that certain ideas were never expressed or known. What truth could be so dangerous as to justify such an apparatus of repression? The suppression of the Cathars in the south of France during the 13th century illustrates the fate of those who preserved alternative views. This movement, which incorporated Gnostic elements, including belief in an imperfect creator God and a more complex view of the fall, was brutally exterminated during the Albigensian Crusade. Tens of thousands were massacred, culminating in the infamous siege of Montségur in 1400, where hundreds of perfect Cathars chose death in flames rather than renounce their beliefs. The few surviving Cathar texts suggest a sophisticated theology that included an understanding of Lucifer as a tragic and possibly redeeming being, a vision completely eradicated by sword and fire. The Templars, a powerful military religious order, were disbanded in 1312 after accusations of heresy that included the worship of an entity called Baphomet, often associated with Lucifer. Although modern historians question the veracity of these accusations, evidence suggests that the Templars, after years in the Middle East, had been exposed to esoteric interpretations that challenged Christian orthodoxy. The brutal suppression of the order, with its leaders burned at the stake and its extensive records and libraries confiscated, represents another episode in the systematic erasure of alternative knowledge. The witch hunts in Europe, reaching their peak between the 15th and 17th centuries, targeted not only supposed practitioners of magic, but guardians of pre-Christian folk traditions that preserved elements of ancient worldviews. Many of these traditions included nuanced visions of chthonic and celestial deities that challenged the simplistic Christian duality. In the process of demonizing these traditions, any entity that brought knowledge independent of the ecclesiastical hierarchy was associated with the devil, effectively transforming Lucifer from the bearer of light into the prince of darkness. Ironically, the same institutions that demonized Lucifer often employed tactics of suppression and control that directly contradicted the teachings of love and truth they claimed to uphold. The violent persecution of dissidents, the burning of books, the torture of heretics to extract confessions. These practices reflected the behavior of an insecure tyrant rather than the servants of a benevolent and omnipotent deity. This contradiction has not gone unnoticed by critical thinkers over the centuries, leading many to question whether the official version of history really represented the light side. The silencing continues into modern times, albeit in more subtle forms. Texts such as those from Nag Hammadi, which offer radically different perspectives on early Christian cosmology, are rarely discussed in mainstream theological seminaries or Sunday churches. When they are mentioned, they are often presented as historical curiosities or theological aberrations, not as legitimate interpretations that fundamentally challenge the traditional narrative. This academic and cultural marginalization ensures that, even when physically available, these texts remain spiritually inaccessible to most religious seekers. Considering the possibility that Lucifer could be right doesn't mean aligning ourselves with evil. On the contrary, it means questioning the very definition of good and evil that has been handed down to us. The deepest mystics and philosophers have always understood that true spirituality transcends simplistic dualities. The great Zen master Dogen taught that to study the way of the Buddha is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. Similarly, honestly confronting the Luciferian narrative requires us to temporarily suspend our most fundamental certainties in order to contemplate perspectives that have been deliberately suppressed.
The Gnostic texte présent à Cosmos where ignorance, not sin, is the true evil.
In the Gospel of Truth, attributed to the Gnostic master Valentinus, we read, "The ignorance of the Father produced anguish and terror. The anguish condensed like a mist, so that no one could see." In this vision, Lucifer, as the bearer of the light of knowledge, would not be the author of darkness, but its dispeller. The real sin, then, would not be questioning, but refusing to question, not seeking knowledge, but comfortably accepting imposed ignorance. Hermetic schools, clandestinely preserved for centuries, teach that, as above, so below, indicating that the true nature of the cosmos is reflected within each human being. Following this principle, the external Luciferian rebellion reflects a necessary internal process, the awakening of individual consciousness that inevitably challenges imposed limitations. Haven't we all experienced, at some point in our development, a painful but necessary break with previously unquestioned authorities? Isn't this the very process by which we become autonomous moral beings? The book of Revelation describes Christ as the morning star, Revelation chapter 22 verse 16, the same astronomical title associated with Lucifer. This surprising symbolic convergence has not gone unnoticed by esoteric scholars, who suggest that these figures represent complementary aspects of the same cosmic principle, one externally and the other internally. Christ's sacrifice, bringing salvation through suffering, mirrors in intriguing ways the Luciferian sacrifice described in the Gnostic texts, the angel who falls so that humanity can ascend. Modern science, with its valuing of questioning and evidence over authority and dogma, unconsciously mirrors values attributed to Lucifer in the forbidden texts. Galileo, persecuted for challenging the official ecclesiastical cosmology, and Giordano Bruno, burned at the stake for proposing the multiplicity of worlds, were labeled as heretics. But time has proven that their dangerous questions led to a deeper and truer understanding of the universe. How many times in human history has the demonized questioner turned out to be the true enlightener? In Jewish mystical traditions, particularly in certain Kabbalistic interpretations, Samael, often identified with Lucifer, is described as serving a higher divine purpose, despite his apparent opposition. The Zohar suggests that even apparently negative forces are ultimately instruments of the divine plan. In this more nuanced view, cosmic opposition is not a battle between absolute good and evil, but a necessary dynamic through which creation evolves. How could there be genuine choice without real alternatives, or authentic growth without challenges? Carl Jung, exploring the depth psychology of religious archetypes, proposed that Lucifer represents the necessary shadow of consciousness, that aspect of ourselves that questions, challenges, and ultimately completes the self. One is the shadow of two, Jung wrote, suggesting that God-devil dualism reflects a fundamental psychic unity that has been artificially split. By completely demonizing Lucifer, Jung argued, we externally project and repress essential aspects of our own psyche, thus creating spiritual imbalance and neurosis. The Valentinian Gnostic tradition proposed that true salvation comes through gnosis, not mere intellectual information, but transformative knowledge that awakens the divine spark dormant within each human being. This awakening inevitably upsets the established order, both externally and internally, just as the Luciferian rebellion upset the heavenly order in traditional myths. If the ultimate purpose of human existence is this awakening, wouldn't it be logical for the one who first awakened to be revered rather than demonized? In the myths of various cultures around the world, we find figures of divine tricksters who, through apparent disobedience or trickery, catalyze necessary transformations. Prometheus in Greek mythology, Loki in the Norse sagas, Coyote in Native American traditions, all reflect an intuitive understanding that certain truths can only emerge through breaking with the established order. These traditions recognize what official texts try to deny, that the path to a higher truth often requires that we first question accepted truths. Evil, in the Gnostic texts, is not associated with conscious rebellion, but with willful ignorance or deliberate concealment of the truth. Those who know the truth are free, declares the Gospel of Philip, and the free do not sin, for sin comes from ignorance. If we accept this premise, then the real evil would not be Lucifer offering the fruit of knowledge, but the force that tried to keep humanity in ignorance, punishing it for seeking understanding. This complete inversion of the traditional narrative explains why these texts were so threatening to institutionalized religious power. Perhaps the most disturbing and profound question is this: what if the greatest lie ever told was not that Lucifer is good, but that he is evil? What if the real deception was to convince humanity to fear and reject the very principle, questioning, inner enlightenment, the autonomous search for truth that could set them free? As the esoteric philosopher Manly P. Hall observed, man fears that which would save him more than that which would destroy him. Isn't evil simply the name we give to the light that bothers us because it reveals truths we'd rather not see? The alternative narratives about Lucifer invite us to transcend the dualistic simplifications that divide reality into absolute good and evil. They suggest that light and shadow, obedience and questioning, tradition and innovation are complementary polarities necessary for complete spiritual evolution. Perhaps the real challenge is not to choose definitively between light and dark, but to integrate both into a more holistic understanding that honors both order and chaos, both tradition and revolution, recognizing that true enlightenment embraces and transcends all dualities. If you're interested in exploring more about spirituality, I've specially selected for you some videos full of profound insights and fascinating discoveries that you'll love. Just click on one of them. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to continue this journey of self-discovery and spiritual learning. Your commitment to knowledge is the first step towards transforming your reality.